captured in Annexure C. So what you submit literally is your Annexure C together with your standard bidding document. And the requirement is that you keep Annexure D and Annexure. I'll show you examples of Annexure, of all these annexures when you go down, but your Annexure D and E are supporting your Annexure C. So once you've submitted that, then the procuring organ of state will evaluate the tender. Only tenders that meet the local content requirement will proceed to the next stage of evaluation. So local content has got no points. So you know that when you submit the bids, they'll tell you that those technical specifications they count to so many points. Local content doesn't have any points. If you don't meet the local content requirements, you don't even move to the next phase of evaluation, where they allocate points. So it is a gateway to the next stage of evaluation. So once you submit it, then they look at the bid, the declaration. Then if you move over to the next phase, you get evaluated and eventually get awarded a bid. So that information is sitting with the procuring entity. In this particular case, it is ESKOM. So that information is sitting with ESKOM. There is a requirement on ESKOM to then immediately report that bid which is awarded. So all the tenders that are on designated sectors, there's a requirement for procuring entities to report that information to DTIC. And once that information is reported to DTIC, it is then made available to the SABS. SABS is the only verification agent that is there to do the local content verification, specifically for the public sector tenders. So SABS is currently the only agent that is appointed to conduct this verification. So once that information is presented to SABS, SABS will then identify projects. It may be in consultation with the procuring entities or DTIC or any other interested parties. Will then identify and say these are the tenders that will be evaluated. And in this particular instance, DPE, because it's responsible for ESKOM, together with DTIC and the SABS, we were involved in identifying the tenders that needed to be evaluated. So that process involved, it also involved the DPE network. So then that information was communicated to ESKOM that the following tenders will be evaluated for local content. So once we've done that, once a supplier has been identified for verification, then a communication then goes out to the supplier. Supplier so and so you have been identified for verification. Please prepare the relevant information to support the local content claim that you made when you were awarded the bid. And remember, when you are awarded the bid, you are awarded the bid based on the declaration, and the circulars specifically mentioned that tenders may be subject to verification. So the verification is to confirm whether the declaration that you made at the time of submitting the bid was correct. So we then quote, once we then it's given that we may ask for additional information, because obviously we haven't, at the time when we contact you, we don't have access to your Annexure D, we don't have access to your Annexure E. So we certainly will ask you to share with us your Annexure D and Annexure E, or maybe even broader, share with us the bill of material of the particular product that you are making. And that information is then actually used to scope the project. It is obviously there's an internal element where we then present to whoever is financing the verification to say, look, this is how much we're going to recover for this particular project. But the verification is then conducted. I'll explain the verification process further down. Once the verification is conducted, we come up with the outcome. The outcome could be either, yes, we confirm the local content that you claimed at the time of bidding, or we could come to a conclusion that the local content you claimed was actually incorrect, and we assess whether the local content that you've achieved, is it above or below the required local content threshold. If it is above, it is well and good. If it is below, then we then need to advise that, look, we advise you as the supplier first that your local content is below what you declared. and it is below the required local content threshold as stipulated in the circular. If you can then share, we share with you the outcome. How did we get to that conclusion? And we agree on that. Then eventually the results are shared with the procuring entity and the DTIC, because DTIC is the custodian of this policy. So we'll share the results with the procuring entity and the DTIC. That is where it ends with us, because we don't necessarily deal with contractual matters. It then becomes a matter of what happens then, which is a contractual matter between yourself and the procuring entity, in this particular instance, ESKOM. But what we do, we also keep a database of all the verifications that we've done for future purposes. The verification process itself, the diagram on the right, it is a nice illustration of what I've already explained previously. So I'm just going to deal with the technical aspect, which is the verification methodology. The methodology itself is premised on the requirements of SANS 1286, which is the standard for conducting local content verification. And based on that, we've then come up with a model that involves both financial and technical verification. So your financial verification involves tracing transactions. In other words, if you said you bought steel from XY Steel Manufacturing, we are able to see that there's an invoice linking that transaction, that procurement, to that particular supplier. We satisfy ourselves that yes, we actually bought steel from a local manufacturer. The second part, which is the technical assessment, the technical verification, it looks at whether you have a plant in the first place, whether you are manufacturing, whether your manufacturing plant is equipped with the relevant equipment to actually manufacture the product that you're claiming. Remember, the requirements of SANS 1286 is that for you to claim local content, the manufacturing must have happened in the country. So we need to confirm that, yes, you are manufacturing and it is happening in the country. And then you do have, if you say you're bending or you're pressing and so forth, we look at your facilities. Do you have the pressing equipment? Do you have the bending equipment? You're grinding? Those are all the things that we look at that. And over and above that, we look at, composition of your skills. Do you have the right skills to actually do the work that you're claiming to be doing? Do you do the work? In other words, your plant, your equipment, are they calibrated? Are they looked after? Are they actually in a working condition? Because people can easily claim to be manufacturing when, yes, they've got a plant, but it hasn't been operational and they're actually importing stuff. So we do that, and then that is all what the technical auditor, the technical verification does. It also confirms, if you give us the bill of material of a particular product that you're manufacturing, the technical auditor will look through the bill of material and confirms whether it is indeed complete. So it's important that we get a complete bill of material. No items are omitted, and that is basically, in a nutshell, what the technical auditor do. This is a broader explanation of what the technical auditor does. I've already explained it. We also look at the capability of the manufacturing plant. Remember, if you are telling us that your plant can only manufacture, if we can verify that your plant can only manufacture 10,000 units per month, but the contract that you've entered into with ESKOM requires you to supply 50,000 units per month, we will then have to ask ourselves, how do you manage to make up for the shortfall? It could either be saying you doubling up in terms of the shifts, maybe instead of a one shift day, you scale up, you're running a 3-day shift, but then again, that takes you to about 30,000. And if we look at the example that I've made, there's still another 20,000 shortfall. The question is, where do you get that? And obviously we'll look at that. There could be quite a lot of answers to that, or it could be that you're actually importing the balance. We'll look at that, and then what does that mean? The verification will look at that. The verification process in itself is actually the whole process. We can break it down into 3 phases. The preliminary stage, which we call it the pre-verification. This is where the whole stuff that I was talking about, where we're tracking you as a supplier. This is actually form part of the pre-verification activities. We're communicating to you. We're requesting you to supply us with information. I tell you, all of you guys have received letters asking you to supply or make available the information. So that's part of the preliminary stage, where we identifying the resources to be allocated to a particular project, where we actually costing the project. These are all the stages that we call them preliminary stages, pre-verification. The field work, that is when now we come to your facilities. And the verification itself involves, it's not a desktop where we just say tick, tick, desktop. It involves us coming to your facilities, visiting your facilities, confirming that exactly what I was explaining that the technical auditor does. But over and above that, the financial auditor will also come to your facilities, look at invoices and trace that. Over and above that, the verification process extends to your suppliers, because the fact that you bought a local, you bought an input component locally doesn't necessarily make it local. There's always a saying that procuring locally isn't equivalent to local content. You could be buying from a local distributor who is just in there to receive stuff and distribute. And in that instance, there is absolutely no local content. Or you could be buying from a local manufacturer, and that is very critical. You're buying from a local manufacturer. The local manufacturer could be using imported components. So there is obviously some value add, and you, as a person who buys from that, you'll benefit from the value add that supplier puts into that input component. So our verification takes us to your suppliers, where we look at what is the local contribution that you're getting from your suppliers. It may also take us to their suppliers as well, where we also look at what are the input components that they're getting from their suppliers. It also depends on the complexity of the project. The examples that I've got here, they illustrate that quite interestingly. And finally, the reporting phase, where exactly like I said earlier on, that we finalize, we calculate the local content, we discuss the results with you, we tell you exactly the outcome, and eventually we finalize and issue the report. Those are the 3 stages that we're engaging in with as we connect. So this is just for your purposes to say, how then do you, as a manufacturer, able to achieve the local content requirements? We've put up this as just as you can do it, or you may decide not to do it, depending on. I mean, there are quite a lot of. It's not a cast in stone approach. Some others are able to achieve the required local content without necessarily following it to the T, but it certainly guarantees you high local content value. One is that you must have a plant. If you are not a manufacturer, you are a distributor, make sure that the person who supplies you with the product has the manufacturing plant. Remember, bidding is not limited to manufacturers in the public space. Bidding is not limited to manufacturers. If I decide to become an entrepreneur, I can team up with manufacturers and be a distributor of their products. That also will allow me space to trade with government. Secondly, is that in those plants, they are doing manufacturing. So there is manufacturing taking place in the country. Secondly, thirdly, you use locally manufactured input components. This is very critical, not locally sourced input components, but locally manufactured input components. And then the 4th one is you use local labor. So the first 4 pillars are very critical because you almost have direct control of that. The 5th pillar, which is critical, is also ensuring that with collaboration with your suppliers, you encourage them to repeat the 4 pillars. So if your suppliers, remember you're buying from them and you're getting value add, you're getting their value add. So if they duplicate the 4 pillars that you are doing, if they do that and duplicate that, they are likely to give you high local content input components, which will contribute to your local content. And then the final one is knowing the designated requirement, the designation requirements. If you're submitting a bid and you know the designation requirements, you must be able, you should, like I said earlier on, for instance, the prepaid meters. You can manufacture a prepaid meter, you can import a populated PC board. That will immediately disqualify your prepaid meter. But if you know that there's a requirement over and above the local content requirement, there's a requirement that the PC board population for the particular meter must be done in the country, then at least you know you'll put up the systems in place to ensure that PC board population is happening in the country. The formula that we're using is in line with the SANS 1286, which is LC equals to 1 minus X over Y multiplied by 100, where the value of X is equal to the imported content, value represents the imported content, Y being the bid price. And what is critical here is the exchange rate. If you've got imported content, it means then it has to be converted at some stage, converted from the foreign currency to the South African rand. And normally the standard conversion rate that is applicable is the rate that was the ruling rate that was applicable at the time on the date when the tender was advertised at 12 midday. That is very critical. This ensures that everybody else on that for that particular tender can convert the imported product at the same rate. So nobody gets to benefit when by converting it at a slightly lower rate than the others. We're all converting at the same rate. So it's the ruling rate applicable on 12 midday on the date when the tender was advertised. Okay, then the next thing we can explain is the annexures. I think you guys must have seen, you probably have had sight of this document. We've cut it out. There's another element on the far right, which is a summary. But I think what is key is the first part. If you look at it, this is a bus company submitting the unibody bus builders. They're submitting to Gauteng Purchasing Department for the purchase of 30-seater commuters and the 60-seater commuters. If you look at it, these guys, the tender price, they've got a 250 for a 30-seater commuter, 250,000. For a 60-seater commuter, they're selling it for 400,000. They've applied to for an exemption. Let me explain the exemption. The exemption is given by the DTIC, and this is not an exemption from applying the law, but is an exemption to use an imported component. The law still applies. The product in question is designated and it is procured in line with the requirements, but the supplier has got a component which is required to manufacture this bus. They can't find it in the country, and they've looked around in the country, they can't find it, and then eventually they then go to DTIC and say, DTIC, there's this component which is a requirement for this bus that we're manufacturing. We can't find it in the country. Can we get an exemption? Then DTIC will give them an exemption, and in that instance, that exemption is then excluded from the bid price. So if you see here, these guys had an exemption. C11, they've got an exemption, and then C12 is the net tender value, which is now the tender value excluding the exemption. Then what you then see in C13 is the imported content. The imported content, it has to correspond with what you've captured on your Annexure D. I'll show you Annexure D shortly. So if you've completed your Annexure D, you then take what you have in Annexure D and transfer it to this C13. And then your local content, which is now the local value, which is now an C14. This will be the same as what you've got in your Annexure E. So you then calculate your local content using the formula that I've shared with you. And in this particular case, they had 84 and 86 respectively. Your Annexure D, which is now, this is the Annexure D. You capture right at the top, you capture the exempted imported content. And that is very critical because you apply to DTIC and say, I'm asking for an exemption. That information, you have got to capture it up there so that we see that there's an imported content, it is exempted, and this is the value. Then you've got the import value. In other words, the items that you imported yourself. So you are a manufacturer, you bring in an imported item, you use it in the manufacturing process, you capture it there. It could be that your suppliers in manufacturing the component that you're using in as an input component, they have imported certain items. So they've imported by third party, it will go in there under imported by third party. So you then have the imported value by third party, and all of that total imported content, you then calculate that, and then you can then transfer that to Annexure C. Annexure E, that is where you capture all the components that you sourced locally, your steel, fabrication, and so forth. All the things that you bought from a local supplier, you all put here. And again, it's you be mindful that sourcing locally does not mean equate local content. Find what the local content value is of these items that you're buying from your suppliers. And then eventually you get to the value that you've come up with, which is your local value, local value of what you've done. You then keep this information. This Annexure C and Annexure D are documents that you should have. When we come in for verification, you should be able to share with us these documents, and obviously, or any other information that we may request from you. That is in a nutshell the whole verification process. I'm going to show you an example, a very simple example of bolts and nuts. I took this one because it's got a fairly simple and straightforward manufacturing process. Here is a guy who manufactures bolts and nuts, and they're selling these bolts and nuts to ESKOM. Bolts and nuts manufacturers does not necessarily manufacture steel. They buy steel from the distributor. What are they doing? They're doing heat treatment, they're doing surface panelizing, they're doing thread forming and the rolling. They're probably doing protective coating on some of their products, or sometimes outsource protective coating. But what we know, bolts and nuts Pty Ltd does not necessarily buy steel. They don't make steel. They buy it from somebody else. Also, you saw this the bolts and nuts that we showed. They galvanized. They don't make that galvanizing chemicals. They don't make the galvanizing product. They buy it from someone else. But they probably, or they may be probably getting somebody else to do the galvanizing. But what are we getting then? So it means then that at this supplier, we can confirm heat treatment, we can confirm surface panelizing, we can confirm thread forming or enrolling. We probably can confirm some of the protective coating that they do, but we can't confirm whether the steel that they're using is actually local. Means then that we need to move to the next tier level of supply. Now, if we move to the next tier level of supply, we then see that steel is supplied by supplier A. Supplier A is a local supplier, but that in itself, it doesn't make it a local steel. The fact that it's supplied by a local supplier doesn't make it a local steel. We then may have to go to this supplier A and say, where do you get your steel? And they tell us probably, okay, this is the type of steel that's manufactured by ArcelorMittal. Okay, we get confirmation from ArcelorMittal in the form of the certificate or whatever the case it is. We get that confirmation. Okay, we know how much is the local content value of that steel. We put it in. Galvanizing, it also from supplier B, we do the same. Plating, they may be having some plating done on some other items. We do the same. We go to our supplier C. So that's in a nutshell. It shows you for a simple product, we may end up visiting about 4 suppliers or 5 suppliers. The main supplier, who's the bolt and nut manufacturer, and the immediate suppliers, which is the steel supplier, the galvanizing guy, and probably the plating guy. So this is exactly what's going to be happening with you. We're going to be visiting you, and we're going to move over to your suppliers. And the expectation is that, and this is very critical for the success of this project, we expect you to have a good relationship with your suppliers, and therefore communicate with them that, colleagues, I buy from you the following component, and the SABS is conducting a verification. They may come in and ask for additional information from you to confirm whether in actual fact the product that you're supplying me is actually local or not. So we're expecting you, as people who are got a relationship with those suppliers, to start communicating that information. Yes, we will go to them. We'll probably request you to maybe do the intro, but that arrangement to actually make sure that the relationship continues from you to the supplier, we will certainly expect you to actually facilitate and make sure that it happens. I had other examples, like for instance, the bogie. If you look at the iron ore car, this one is slightly complex. If you think about the bogie element, which is, these guys don't make the bogie, they buy the bogie and assemble. They're doing the grinding, the welding and so forth of the bucket, but the bogie itself, which is the bogie, they buy the bogie from another supplier, and that supplier doesn't necessarily make up all these components. Those components, the bogie components, like you see here, these are all the bogie components. The bogie supplier is not making all these components. They buy these components from another supplier, which, if we were to verify this particular item, it means we'll go to the bogie supplier, and from a bogie supplier, we go to their material suppliers, and that too may take us further down to other suppliers and so forth. That's basically in a nutshell. I'm going to stop now so that we allow an opportunity for discussions and questions and clarity on all the issues that we've discussed. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Achua. I think that was very, very informative. Colleagues, there's some key points that come through from the presentation. I think the one that stands out is locally supplied does not mean locally manufactured. I think it's a key point. The emphasis around the bill of materials, and the more detailed the bill of materials is, the more accurate it is, the easier it makes the verification process. The point that Ms. Achua has highlighted a few times over, it doesn't stop with you as the first line supplier, but it goes to your suppliers, and it could even go to your suppliers' suppliers. So it's important that you sharing with your suppliers this particular project and the fact that SABS could be knocking on their doors, but also your suppliers should be sharing with their suppliers as well. And so the effectiveness of this process is dependent on how well we're communicating with the different tier levels. I think as well, from the example, you would have seen that it could go down to a tier 3 or a tier 4. So it can go further back into the process, and it all comes from the concept of locally produced input material is what local content is trying to verify, and then it looks at the value add. So as there's value add, you then would go to the next levels in the process itself. Some points that I want to highlight before we open the floor to questions. The first one is it's about teamwork to get this verification process done and for it to be done effectively. So it's all about how quickly and how accurately data sets are made available to the SABS team for these verifications to take place. So some of the documents that Ms. Achua has shared, the Annexure C is what you would have already made available at the time that the tender was being looked at. But your Annexure D and E, you should have already available. And it's that information together with your bill of material that SABS is going to be requesting. And the soonest we can get that back, I think there is a deadline for this Friday. The whole intention behind it is the sooner we get the information, the sooner the SABS team can scope the work. And the sooner we scope the work, then the sooner we can move it into the actual on-site verification exercises. I mentioned that the teamwork. So firstly, it's US suppliers. It's what we've highlighted about you talking to your suppliers and your suppliers speaking to their suppliers. So it's about going back in the value chain. We've also invited on this call the representatives from ESKOM. Colleagues, can you mute on your side? Sorry, someone's.
I want to wake up.
Get someone.
I'm not waking up. I'm very.
Shanine, can you mute the colleague that's.
Excuse me.
All right.
Okay. No. All that sleep is coming back.
I can't seem to see who. Okay, it's been muted now. So I think going further back, I spoke about the teamwork. So we have representatives from ESKOM that are on the call from the ESKOM procurement teams. And it's important that as US suppliers are talking to the ESKOM team, and as we're trying to get additional information to make this exercise effective and to get to the real local content percentage, it's important that we're supporting each other to obtain the necessary data sets. On the call is also representatives from SABS in the form, so you have Refilwe, you've got Shanine, you've got Malebo and Millicent. And these are all names, colleagues, that as you are sharing information, these are people that you're going to encounter. They're going to be contacting you. As I said, the more information we get, the quicker and the more effective the verification process can be. I think the last point then, before we open the floor to questions, and you can start to get to raise your hands so that I could then allow you to raise your questions. But I think the last point is the presentation itself will be shared with you. So you will get a copy of the presentation, so you don't need to worry about that aspect. So there was a hand when we started off. Guideman had his hand up. I'm not sure if that was in error or if it is a hand. But colleagues, I will also take questions, or if there's any points of clarity that you require, anything that we can advise you on now that will make this process more streamlined, please do not hesitate to raise those questions. So it seems to me that Masacho has done an exceptionally good presentation with a lot of detail. I do see two hands that have now come up, so let's take them in sequence. I think Ruby, you can come in first. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. I've got 2 or maybe 3 questions that I would like to ask. The first one pertaining to our suppliers. When we communicate with our suppliers, what sort of information or heads up do we give them in terms of the audit or the verification process? What is expected from them, and how do we get them ready for the process as well? I presume you're not going to audit anything on exempted goods. The last question that I want to ask is, if for whatever reason the outcome of the audit says we are not meeting the required local content, is there any rectification program that we can enter into so that we can remedy any shortfall that we might have? Or what is the eventual outcome if we are not? Is there any penalties that we're going to be imposed to us for not meeting the required?
So they are taking the.
Great, thanks, Ruby. I'm struggling. I think somebody was just spoken, but Ruby, I think we've got your 3 questions. Is there anything else, Ruby, or can we take it as complete?
I think that's complete for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Ruby, what I'm going to do is, I think on those 3 questions, I'd like Masachwa to just come in and provide that response straight away, and then thereafter we'll go to Andrew. So Masachwa, if you can come in on those 3 questions, over to you.
Thank you, Nish. Firstly, I think on the communication with suppliers, exactly how we've communicated to you, we would want you to, we take it that you've obviously had some lengthy observation in terms of what has been communicated to you. So we expect you to start communicating with them, like we're saying that, if you start communicating with them early and making sure that they buy into the whole process and are able to prepare themselves for the verification. But you can communicate to them to say, look, this is what we claimed as local content on the product that you're supplying us, please make sure that you're prepared, you've got all the information to support the local content value that you claimed on the particular product. Ideally, this is a communication that needs to happen before you make a declaration, because you really, if you're getting an input component from someone else, you can only claim a local content percentage only with an indication from the particular supplier to say, look, I'm selling you this compressor that you're using in here. The local content you can claim on this particular equipment is probably 40%, whatever the percentage is. So then the discussion becomes easier when you get verified, because the person would have given you that percentage and said, look, this is the local content percentage. And the question whether we're going to verify exempted goods. If an item is exempted, we're certainly not going to verify that. But what then becomes important is whether you've converted it at the correct rate and whether you've used the correct amount. That is critical. We still need to confirm that. If it was, you bought it for $10,000 and the conversion rate on the date was 15 rand to $1, we just confirm that. And obviously, what the next thing that we might want to see is an exemption letter, which will always support the fact that the claim that it is exempted. There would be an exemption letter from the DTIC, which indicates that an item has been exempted. So those two is an exemption letter. And then what we do is look at the values, whether the conversion rate used is actually the correct conversion rate. What happens if, in the event that you do not meet the local content requirements? It's an engagement that will happen between you and the procuring entity. I don't know what the agreement between you and the procuring entity is. I know that some procuring entities do include a clause that deals with what happens in the event that you don't meet the local content requirements. But from our side, we do the verification and we report. It might be, I don't know whether maybe we might have to, it's a response that can best be addressed by ESKOM, whether in their contracts, whether they do include consequence management for incorrect disclosures, or there could be reasons why you're not meeting the requirements. Again, the question might be what happens if, for instance, we are verifying now. You were awarded a tender in 2018, and in 2018, the supplier that was supplying you with a particular component has since closed down. But that too, it should have been communicated to the procuring entity to say, look, this is what we've declared, what we had declared as local content. It was based on this supplier giving us this, and we've since learned that, due to COVID, the supplier has closed down. We can't meet the local content requirements anymore. But like I'm saying, that it should have been communicated. But certainly, in terms of what will then happen to you, it's a matter that we as the SABS will not be able to respond to. It is only ESKOM that will be able to respond. And probably if there isn't any arrangement between, if ESKOM hasn't got anything, the DTIC will certainly give guidance in terms of that to say what then happens to you.
Thanks, Musachwa. I think that's fairly clear. So to re-emphasize, the role of SABS in all of this is to report, and our report will then go to, in this case, ESKOM, and there is an escalation that ESKOM would have, or they'll be able to get guidance in terms of the next steps from the DTIC directly. So I do hope that has covered all the questions on this side. I'd like to then, Andrew, it's over to you. I'm not sure if your question was answered. I see your hand might have been lowered. Andrew, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, my question was answered in terms of the exemption, but I have a more general question regarding procurement. Is it is it acceptable to the SABS, excuse me, that in many instances where specialized equipment is involved, there may only be a single sole supplier in the country, and it makes it impossible to obtain competitive bids from sub-suppliers or subcontractors? Is that does that not create a problem?
Thanks, Andrew, for that question. I think Masachwa and maybe even Malebo might be able to come in on that. But Masachwa, you want to give it the first step? Thank you.
Thanks, Dinesh. Firstly, let me specify that the local content regime is not intended to stifle competition. In my understanding, having worked with the DTIC, when they designate, they certainly will not designate an item where there's only one supplier, or where it will stifle. The intention is to certainly not impact on the competition. But having said that, where, for instance, an item is not available and the sector is designated, before you make a bid submission, you can then apply for an exemption. Like I said earlier on, there's an exemption process which is managed by the DTIC, where, for instance, you find that the item that you are going to be using as an input component is not available in the country. Or I know that in some instances, the issue of a price has been raised to say, look, we can find a competitive price elsewhere. The price that is offered locally is too high. And DTIC has always considered that. But you need to apply for an exemption before you make your submission for the bid.
Thanks, Masachwa. I see a hand from Brian. Colleagues, we have about 8 minutes on the call, so let me take Brian's hand. Over to you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. It's Brian Ray from MEPS. With regards to a lot of the ESKOM tenders, where the buyer is issuing the tender, but the technical part of the job is actually written by the engineering department, which adjudicates things separately to the buying department and commercially. And a lot of the times the buying department or the procurement side of things will request that we have to put local content and all that in. But then the engineering guys, which you get marked and scored for, they want a particular brand name or an OEM piece of equipment. How do we handle this going forward with the SABS? Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Brian, sorry, just if I can just get clarity, and you represent which, is it ESKOM or one of the suppliers?
No, we're a supplier to ESKOM. We build a lot of the equipment and that for them, yeah. All
right, great stuff, thanks. Thanks. Masachwa, would you be in a position to take that question as well? Over to you.
Yeah, okay. No, it's fine. Brian, I know that DTIC has always, in all the conversations with procuring entities, sort of cautioned against the use of brand names when buying. They need to mention specifics. I know it's happening, like the fact that you're mentioning, I know I've had in several instances where when you look at the bid, it talks to the brand name. But I know that the DTIC is constantly discouraging the use of brand names, rather use the specifications. There is absolutely nothing from our side we can do. I think it's a matter that if you are an aggrieved supplier, you probably can take up with the DTIC right at the time when the bid is out. Because remember, when the bid is out and you see that in the spec document, they make reference to a brand name, you can immediately take it up with the DTIC and say, hang on here, this is anti-competitive because it specifically mentions who to buy from. And that is not the intention.
Okay, so what you're saying is I mustn't refer directly to the guys from ESKOM themselves. I must take it up with the DTIC.
Well, as a probably as a first point of call, you may refer it back to ESKOM. If you don't get any joy, you can escalate it to the DTIC.
Okay, thank you very much. It answers my question.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Brian. And I think it's an important point because the DTIC does have a mandate and they do have a clear view of what they want, what the expectation is around local content and what it should be giving the country as a value add. So I think to the point, if in this case, ESKOM or any of the state-owned entities, your first line is obviously to escalate to them, but certainly the second line is you have that direct line to DTIC whilst the tender is still out. So I think with that said, we really come to the tail end of the presentation and the feedback session itself. I think from our perspective and from a SABS perspective, I just want to emphasize that we are working within extremely tight timelines to deliver these, what we call and refer to as the phase 1 of the verification exercise. And so we really make an appeal to you as suppliers that are in the room to meet the timelines as specified, which is this Friday to get all your data sets submitted to SABS and by no later than this Friday. So if you can do it by tomorrow, great stuff. The whole intention behind it is that the quicker the SABS team can scope the verification, the quicker we choose the right teams to come out and do the work. And the sooner we get past you as the supplier and we start to map out who from your supply chain needs to then be included in the process itself. So as you would have seen, the verifications could go down to tier 2, tier 3 in the process. And so we need that sufficient time to be able to do this. What's nice about this whole process is that at the end of this, we're getting some real data around what is the real capability in terms of supplying locally and what is the local content percentage, not just what was declared, but what has been vetted and what seems to be an average that we can achieve in our country. So this is going to become very useful information as we go forward. I can also emphasize or state and emphasize that this is just the start of the process. The Department of Public Enterprises has committed to continue with this program over the next 3 to 4, going up to 5 years. And the whole thinking around it is to extend it to more of the state-owned entities that fall within their umbrella itself. So it's going to be a very interesting stage for us. I think there's going to be valuable information coming from this. And you yourselves as suppliers will be able to start to access, as we have this information available, it'll start to get put onto our websites. And we'll start to see that for various products, there might be a designation of 90%, but we can only achieve currently in our country 80% as an example. And these are just important stats to start to have that we're hoping both you will be able to get sight of, but more importantly, DTIC will also have sight of, what are the real capabilities in South Africa itself. So with that said, I would like to then thank all of you for taking the time for attending this session. We really value your time. We value the partnership we're going to be establishing with you as suppliers to ESKOM as we try to deliver this project within this month of March itself. So with that said, I would like to then thank you once again and bring this webinar to a close. Thank you, and the meeting is now closed.